Hey guys, Moody here. Welcome to episode 2 of DH3 scripting tutorials, and today I am going to go over my Slapchop plugin.
You're gonna love my
So
nuts.
to give you a quick idea of what this does, if you go into the fishing tab and click on one of your fish that you want to cook, you have to enter the number, hit cook, close, and kind of go through each fish you have in order to do that. What the Slapchop plugin does is it lets you just right click on the fish and it will just cook either all of the fish you have or the maximum that you can based on how much heat that you have. The script also includes a button on this page which lets you enable or disable the feature. I thought the script would be really good to do because it introduces a few new features such as using a base64 image in your script. It covers item boxes, which I briefly touched on before, and also loading and saving settings for your script. So first, let's quickly go over some of the research that's needed for this script. The first part is we know we're going to be clicking or right-clicking on these item boxes here. Now, an item box is just any of these squares you see. Smitty has a class. Let me see if I can find it here. Here, so it says class item box, and basically they all kind of act in a similar way, and they listen to click events, and they have similar formatting and that sort of thing. Now, if you're not familiar with JavaScript HTML events, the on click handles the left click, and the on context menu handles the right click. So as you can see, each of these fish item boxes already have a right click method here, and it calls this right clicks item function with the name of the item. Now, this function here returns true or false, which basically tells the browser, do you actually want to pop up the context menu or not? And the context menu is just that little default menu you get when you right click anywhere on the page. So what we're going to do is similar to what we did in the last video, is we're going to override this method and look for basically the name of any raw food, and then basically send a message to cook that food based on how much heat we have and how much of that food we have. So if we jump over to TamperMonkey, we can create a new script. I've already kind of set up the basic outline here to get started. So the first thing I'm going to do here is create some skeleton functions. So we're going to need a way to enable the script, and to disable it, and then a way to toggle it. So basically the button is going to be used to enable and disable it, so the toggle will detect what the current state is and just set it to the opposite of that. So when the user right clicks an item box, it sends the name of the item to that function, and it could be food, it could be raw food, it could be cooked food, it could be something completely different. So we need a way to, one, determine if the item is raw food, and if it is, we need to get some information about it. So this will just be a function called find food, and it'll take a name, and it will either return the food item if it's found, or basically nothing if it doesn't find it. And if we determine that the item is a piece of raw food, we will send that food object to another function called try_cook_food, and it will take the food object that we found from the findFood function. And then finally what I'm going to do is add a function called initUI, and this is just a function that gets called from the normal init method. But if you have a lot of UI code, sometimes it's a good idea to put it in its own function so that it's just more organized. So now that our script is broken down this way, it makes it a lot easier to tackle small bite-sized chunks at a time rather than trying to compose the whole thing at once. Let's start with the enable and disable functions. These are just going to let us turn the features of the script on or off. For this, we're going to use something called local storage, and this is just your browser's way of saving key value pairs locally to the browser. There is a size limit, so you don't want to store huge objects in there, but it's perfect for relatively small strings and settings. So since this is a key value pair, we're going to need a key to work with. Try to make this something unique. Usually you put your script name and then like some setting name with it. So I'm just going to call this const enabled key equal to Divinity tutorial dot enable, I guess 2 dot enabled. And then with that, I'm just going to have a variable called enabled, which whenever we change it, we will set that accordingly. Now, the way you set this is there's a global object called local storage, and then you just say set item, give it the key and the value. And the value is always going to end up being a string, so when you're reading it back, you need to parse it. So even if you send it true, it's going to come back as the string true rather than the Boolean value true. And then when we enable it, we also want to set enabled to true. Now the disable is going to be pretty much the same, except instead of true, it's going to do false. You might want to combine enabled and disabled since they're pretty much the same thing. But I'm going to add a couple extra lines to these in the future, so I'm going to leave them separate for now. Next is the toggle function, and that's just going to look at the current value in the enabled variable and then call either enable or disable depending on what that is. So we could just say if enabled, we're going to disable, otherwise we want to enable it. So the find food function is a little interesting because we get to use one of Smitty's built-in global dictionaries. So if you look in the console here, you can see global underscore, and then there's a whole bunch of interesting things in here. The one we're most interested in is food map. So if you expand this out, you see that it's just a list of food items here, and each of these has a raw food name, how much heat it needs, how much energy it gives you, and a whole bunch of other useful information here. So we're going to match the name that gets passed when they right-click an item box to this raw food name field, and then we're going to use the value in heat to determine how many of that item we can cook. So we could basically do what we need to do in a single line of code, and we're going to do object.values, and what this does is this takes an object and then returns you an array of all of the values in that object, ignoring the keys. So once we have an array, there are a lot of very useful functions that arrays have, such as the find function. And what this does is you pass it a function that evaluates to true or false, and the first object in that array that evaluates to true, that's the value that will get returned. I just remembered that my slap chop script also lets you eat an entire stack of food. So we're actually going to, instead of just try cooking, we're just going to say try use food. And then we're going to match not only on the raw value, but also the cooked value. And then based off of what that is, we're either going to try to cook it or eat it. So what we're going to do here is, let's say food, and then if food.raw food name and food.cooked food name includes the name that we got passed to this function. So this is just creating an array with the raw and the cooked versions in there, and then the includes just checks if this name is in that array. So if either of these strings are equal to the name we got passed, this will return true and we will have found the food that we're looking for. And then of course you have to actually return that value. And the next thing I want to do is implement the try use food. Now, since this food is either the raw or the cooked version, we're also going to want to pass the name itself so we can determine which one it is. So if food.raw food name is equal to name, we're going to try to cook it, else we're going to try to eat it. Now let's take a look what happens when we try to eat or cook a piece of food. So if we inspect this, we can see that it goes to clicks item or right clicks item. That's not very helpful, mostly because the code is obfuscated and it's going to be a pain in the ass to look through. So what we're going to do instead is take a look at the WebSocket and see what kind of message gets passed to the server. So to look at the WebSocket message, you need to go to your network tab here on the bottom. And if you've loaded the page without looking at the network page, it's not going to show anything here, so you just need to refresh. And once that comes back, this diamondhunt.co thing will pop up, and you can basically look at all your messages here. Now, in Chrome at least, the outgoing messages are highlighted in green, and the ones coming in are in white. And we're going to be interested in anything that gets sent out. So what you want to do is perform the action that would generate the message. So if I take a look at one of these raw shrimps here, and I cook one of them, or let's just do two, and I hit cook, you'll see that this is the message that gets sent. It says cook raw shrimp and then the number. So go over here and let's just make a note of that. And then we want to do the same thing for eating something. So if we just eat these shrimp that we just cooked, just consume, you see we get a similar message here. Consume shrimp and then the number. So we'll go back over here and make another note of that. And so in order to send a string to the server, there's a function called send bytes, and this just takes a string and will literally just send this to the server. Of course, if we try to send a number of shrimp that's more than what we have, it'll basically tell us you can't do that. So we need to figure out how many shrimp we want to send. And the same is true if you try to cook more fish than you have, or if you try to cook an amount of fish that you don't have enough heat for. So as far as I know, every item in the game has a variable that holds the string version of the number of that item that you have. So if we want to look up how many either raw shrimp or cooked shrimp we have, we can basically say, let's do let n equals window, and then we're going to look up a variable. Now because we don't know the exact name, we're going to pass a string here, and we're going to do var underscore and then just the name that we're looking for. And then we'll also say or 0 in case the variable doesn't exist, because if you don't have an item, basically that variable will be undefined in most cases. And then we just want to parse it. So let's start with the raw version first, and we need to figure out a couple of extra things. So we need to see how much heat we have. So player heat is equal to, we're going to do the same thing with the variable. So parse int window dot, now since we know the exact name here, we don't have to use the string version, we can just do it like this, and then or 0. And that'll tell us how much heat we have. And then we also want to know how much heat is required for a single piece of food. So we'll say food heat equals parse int, because it's stored as a string, of food.heat. So the next thing we need to know is how many of this food we could cook given the amount of heat that we have. So max is equal to player heat over how much heat the food requires. Now this could return a non-whole number, like 1.2 or something like that. So we're just going to do math.floor to get the maximum integer that meets that criteria. And then if the n we calculated before is greater than the max, we'll just say n equals max. So this will prevent us from trying to cook more food than we can. Then all we need to do is check if we are trying to cook at least one food. So if n is greater than 0, then we will tell the server we want to cook the food. So we'll just do cook equals, and then we want food dot raw food name, and then tilde, and then the number that we're going to cook, which is just n. The eating is much simpler because there's no limit to how much you can eat. So we're just going to copy this line here, and n will always be greater than 0 because if it wasn't 0, the item box basically won't show up. And so instead of cook, we'll put consume, and instead of raw food name, we'll just put food name. I'm sorry, cooked food name. So since we're working with this code already, let's skip over the init UI part and go straight to the functionality where the right-clicks item function is going to be overridden. So let's get a reference to the old function. So const original right-clicks item equals window right-clicks item. Let's copy that, and this is going to equal to a new function which takes the item name as a parameter. So we want to keep the value of the original function's return so that if we decide not to handle the item, we can return that value. So we'll just say let original return equals the old function dot apply, and then this and arguments. If the script is enabled, we're going to do our own custom logic. Otherwise, we're just going to return the original return. And if it's enabled, we want to call find food to see if the item is a food, and then if it is, try use food. Food is find food, and then the name that we got passed in here. So if this food exists, we're going to get that value back. Otherwise, it's going to return nothing. So basically, if food, we want to do something else. Again, we want to return the original value here. So now that we know it's a food, we can call this try use food here. So try use food, pass it the food and the name. Make sure we use let there. And then we don't want the context menu to show up regardless of what food it is. So we're just going to say return false. So the next thing we want to do is handle the loading of the enabled setting. And so similar to how we do local storage set item, we're going to do get item instead, and that's going to give us the string either true or false. So if we go down here, we can say enabled is equal to local storage get item, and pass it the key. And so if this is true, it's going to give you the string true. If it's false, it's going to give you the string false. And if it hasn't been set yet, or if it's corrupt for some reason, it's going to give you something totally different. So since this is just a simple Boolean, all we have to do is say, is this equal to the string true? And then similar to what we did in the toggle function, except kind of the opposite, we're going to do if enabled, enable, else disable. And so that will automatically enable it or disable it based on what the user had set previously. So while I was doing that fight, I realized I made a little mistake here. Basically, if this has never been set, it's going to be undefined and it's not going to equal true. And this will make it so the first time you run the script, it will be disabled by default. But we don't want that. We want it to be enabled the first time. So instead of doing this, we can just say that or true, which means if this string evaluates to a falsy value, which does not include the string false, it will instead use this value. I just had the hottest fucking cup of ramen and my mouth is on fire, so I'm gonna finish this later. Anyway, let's fix this first. It's enable, not enabled. And save that, and let's test it out real quick. So refresh. And now if we go to the fishing tab and we right click on the shrimp, eats it, and if we right click on the salmon, cooks it. Perfect. The only thing left to do is to make the toggle button, which we're gonna basically insert another item box like this and display whether it's enabled or disabled, and then if somebody clicks on it, it will toggle it. So let's take a quick look at what the structure of this looks like, and the item box is here, and so you can see that the container of this next level up here, item section fishing 1, basically just has a bunch of item boxes. So what we want to do is put another item box at the beginning of this element. So to do that, we'll go over to this init UI function, and we can do jQuery selector for, item section fishing 1. So this will select that containing div, and then we want to prepend, which will basically put something at the beginning underneath that element. And you can basically specify HTML in a string, and it will create those HTML elements for you, and then you can use jQuery to insert those in. So since I'm really lazy, I'm going to take an existing item box here, edit as HTML, copy the whole thing over, and use that as a basis here. So let me clean this up a little bit.
This one slap at a time.
Okay, so I'm going to make this URL here just fake for now, and I'll explain that later, but we're basically going to fill in the base64 version of the image here. I kind of changed some of the IDs in here, took out some crap that we don't need. For the most part, I left most of the styling as is, so we're going to keep it kind of the default look for the fishing tab. Now, since you can't include image files on Greasy Fork, you could host an image yourself and put the URL here, but another way to do it is to specify this, which is just saying it's a data, it's a PNG, and we're going to supply the base64 data. And then you can go to Google and just look for base64 image encoder, and you can use this site or one of a million other sites that let you basically upload an image and it'll give you the base64 string back. Alright, so let's go over to Google Images, and I believe this is the image I used originally, but I forgot that the Slap Chop guy was also the ShamWow guy.
ShamWow, you'll be saying wow every time.
Instead. So if I just save the image, and I actually already saved it, and then we go over here and upload it, ShamWow. Now this will convert it, and you can just do this copy image here. And then let's go back here, and this source is going to be very large. It's basically all the data in mostly alphanumeric characters. The key part to note is that at the beginning of it, up until the base64 comma, if it's a PNG image, you would put PNG here, or if it's a GIF image, you would put GIF there. Basically, the extension would go there, and then all the data would go after this last comma here. Alright, and then all that's left is we want to, once we insert it with the prepend method, we want to select it real quick. So another selector here, and click. So we want to attach a click event to it, and we are going to actually, you don't have to make a new function. We can just say toggle. So when they click, this new element that we're inserting is going to call our toggle function up here. Now the other thing we want to do is set this status here based on what the enabled status is. So if we're going to enable it, we can select this and just say text enabled, and then similarly for disabled, okay. So now let's give that a quick test. Actually, I forgot to call this init UI function, so just put that in your init somewhere. And also, I'm going to change slapchop to ShamWow. I don't know if that's one word or two.
ShamWow.
Anyway, let's go over to test, and if we refresh, take a look. Okay, so go over to the fishing tab. We'll see that the ShamWow guy is here. Now it looks like for some reason it didn't add the enable text right away. I think that's because I put the init UI after. Yeah, so let's put this before instead. And that's because this enabled is what adds the text, so it needs to happen after. So save that, and let's refresh again. So now it's enabled. You can click it to toggle it. If it's disabled, then you right click. Not going to do anything. If it's enabled and you right click, it's going to do what we wanted it to do.
You're gonna have an exciting life now.